In this video, we're going to see how to do integration testing in Spring Boot. What's the difference between integration tests and unit tests? Well, it's all about focus. A unit test focuses on a single unit and will, as far as possible, isolate it from all its dependencies through the use of mocking, as we discussed in a previous video. An integration test, on the other hand, will check that this unit works correctly with real objects of its dependent classes. In other words, no mocking is needed for integration tests. In a RESTful API, an integration test is likely to start with a REST controller endpoint and then use real, in other words, non-mock objects for the services and repositories, and that means using a real database. So what about this database? We don't really want to make use of the live database. That just would not be prudent. What we want instead is to have a database that is dedicated to testing. That way, if something goes wrong during testing, we're not corrupting live data. And in Spring Boot, we can define a test database that is separate from the live database. And in this screenshot, you'll see that there are two application properties files. One is in the main folder, the other is in the test folder. So this application.properties file is setting up the environment for when the live application is executing, and this application.properties file sets up the environment for when test classes are being executed. And you'll see here in the test application properties, we're going to use a different database for the testing. We've also identified a different location for the migrations, and you can see here that we've got a migration that is different from the live migrations because we'll have different requirements for our test data. As a reminder, each test should arrange its universe, perform an action, and then assert state. So in this example, we're arranging the universe in terms of deleting all the contents of these two repositories in the database. And it's safe to do that because it's a test database. So we're creating the conditions that are necessary for this test. And this test says that when there are no books, we expect an empty list of book DTO objects. To get the condition of no books, we delete all the copies and all the books from the database. And then we make use of REST template. Now, if you go and look at the full application, you will see that REST template is set up as part of the test class outside of the method. REST template has a method called getForEntity. In other words, it's going to perform a GET request using that URL, expecting that response type, and it's going to give us the entity that represents the response. In fact, there's a response entity class that we can make use of here. So by the time getForEntity has executed, it will have sent in a GET request to this endpoint. That controller's endpoint will then execute and produce a JSON string that will then be stored as part of the response entity object. And we can then assert that the response entity's status code is OK, that the response entity's header's content type is this, and that the response entity's body, which is a string, is equal to that value. So let's take a look at the application in a bit more detail. In the test folder, there are packages that match the packages in the main folder. When we want to test book service, we're focusing on the book service class. So in this test class, we have got a set of tests whose names tell us what we are testing. Some of them will be performing state verification, others will be performing behavior verification. And as far as possible, we're going to be using mock objects because these are unit tests. When we want to test the controller, again, we will use mock objects as far as possible and create real objects of the class that we're focusing on. These are standard JUnit tests that make use of Mockito, and they will run very quickly. But as we noted in a previous video, these JUnit tests are not making use of this Spring environment, and therefore they're not testing all the features. So I've also got an HTTP test for the REST controller, where I'm using the WebMVC test annotation that focuses only on the book REST controller. I'm auto-wiring mock MVC. I'm mocking the book service, and then I'm stubbing the method in that mock book service, and then using mock MVC to perform a test and verify the state. Again, this is a unit test. We're using mock objects and focusing on the real object for the class under test. When we want to perform integration tests, then we're going to make use of the test REST template, which we are auto-wiring so that it will be injected by the application context. And this provides us with a very easy way, as you will see in a few moments, of sending in requests to the application. I'm also using a real book repository, copy status repository. These are all auto-wired, so they will come from the application context. I'm no longer using mock objects. I'm using the real objects in the application. And if we take a look at one of these, we'll get an idea of how it all works. So to set up our environment, we're deleting all the copies and all the books by making use of these real repository objects. And then we're using the REST template object, which has been injected here, to send a GET request for this URL, and then we'll get a response entity object in return that we can then test to verify the state of that response and make sure that it all works correctly. You should take the time to explore this application in a lot more detail and make sure that you understand how it all works together. I recommend also that you do a bit more background reading for the test REST template class.